Welcome everyone to this week's VDEV CPR seminar series. We're very happy to have Nava Ashraf join us today to present her work with Abhijit, Banerjee and Vesall Nourani, who's also joining us, one from Uganda and one from France, I think. They're going to present their paper, Learning to Learn. And some of the basic rules, I think most of you know them by now, but we'll still bring them up in case there are some newcomers. So the seminar will run for an hour. And after that, there will be 15 minutes of Q&A with Nava. And then I will open up the microphone for participants to ask questions live. Throughout the seminar, if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A. And then we will bring them up for Nava if there are clarifying questions or some of the questions at some points during the presentation. And otherwise, Abhijit and Vesall will also answer them in the Q&A. So if your question is not transmitted during this a live presentation, it's not because the question is bad, it's just that we're slow in processing them, or that one of the co-authors answered them, or that we know that the question is going to be answered later on in the talk. And then you're always free to raise your questions at 6 o'clock or at the end of the seminar in the live Q&A as well. That are a bit the rules of the games for the VDEV CPR seminar series. As you know, we don't, we want to have a nice behavior, so we do not tolerate any kind of abusive behavior or so on. And yes, that's about it. Now we're super curious to hear about the paper, Nava.
Wonderful. Just to confirm, you can see my screen? Yes. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm so happy to have my co-authors also here. Abhijit Banerjee and Vesall Nourani. It's really Vesall's brainchild. I'll tell you a little bit more about his work in Uganda that has led to this. And all three of us are deeply inspired and motivated by trying to solve a challenge that I think many people in this seminar community care about, which is this learning crisis all over the world in education. And you can see a range of countries here. In some cases, more than 80% of students, grade 2 students, who could not read a single word of a short text, who could not perform two-digit subtraction. In the country that we'll be talking about, Uganda, where we did this study, you have a situation where, while you have almost 100% of students enrolled in primary education, a very large percentage do not make it into secondary school. So basically about 30% are able to then go on, then 60% are able to, actually of those are able to make it into upper primary school and transition to secondary school. So this is a real challenge, given that we haven't been able to sort of solve this human capital accumulation challenge around the world. And a lot of the discourse is focused on, okay, if the students aren't learning, we need to train the teachers better. And so how do we do teacher training? Let's focus on pedagogy. Let's tell them how to teach. And usually, the standard form of pedagogy is rote learning. That comes from a really deep philosophical construct that we'll talk about in a couple slides, that have to do with really seeing people as vessels in which you deposit information. And so the idea was, okay, this is not how we want people to learn. We really want to be able to teach pedagogy that's more interactive, that's really linked to the right level of learning, and that is structured, with teaching plans. We'll share a little bit of that evidence, which, there are some pedagogical interventions that work. But when you think about what we really need in terms of the capabilities that we would want students around the world to be able to develop, to be able to contribute to the development of their communities and their countries, to be flexible and adaptive to new technologies, for example. Those are capacities that might require teachers to have more autonomy and more degrees of freedom to be able to teach in a way that develops those capacities rather than following a structured pedagogy. And so this intervention teaches teachers how to teach without focusing on teaching. It really teaches them how to teach by helping them understand how we learn as human beings and to actually experience a form of learning that that allows them to have insight into the process of learning. And then through that, they actually themselves come to the conclusion of the best way to teach. And so we work with a partner organization, I'll tell you a little bit more about them, which aims to train teachers not to be disseminators of knowledge, or even in some sense appliers of knowledge, but really generators of knowledge, producers of knowledge, and to see themselves as individuals who are generating knowledge, and even to help their primary school students see themselves as generators of knowledge, which is kind of a crazy idea for those of us who were trained in the, to be scientists only once you've done your PhD. But they do that by thinking about all of the sort of techniques of science that we have learned, but applying them from the very beginning of early life, basically, posing sharp questions, using precise language, what it means to actually be precise with our language, to frame hypotheses and to gather data to test those hypotheses, to find processes of gathering data and how data production occurs, and then how to create inference from that. And again, the idea that primary school students would actually be able to learn at these capacities seems initially maybe not so easy, but I'm going to go through how it is that this NGO has trained teachers in this, and then how they apply it in a primary school classroom. It's upper primary school, so it's mainly grade 6 and grade 7. And the second year they go to grade 5, but grade 6 and grade 7. So it's an RCT. They trained 40% of the teachers in treated schools after 2 years. And as I said, we focus on upper primary a lot because of this, real drop that happens in terms of transition to secondary school, really all over the world. And that's what we wanted to start to test its effects on. Okay, so headline results, a really big effect on, so this is just the a main outcome variable, which is from Ministry of Education, administrative data matched with the treatment status of the schools. So this is the primary leaving exam pass rate. The control group, as we talked about, only 50% make it through to be able to go to secondary school. The treated group is up to 75%. The interesting thing, in addition, is that not only is there a very large mean effect, there's a real, and not only is there a shift in the distribution. So it's not that, you see a normal distribution, which then just shifts to the right. Look at these two different distributions, the control and the treatment group. They're really changing shape. And you go from something that's where the mass is very strongly on the left-hand side to something where there's much more of a normal distribution. And so there is something that they're doing that is sort of really applying across the distribution of students. And we think that the mechanism, and I'll talk a lot more about mechanisms, but just to kind of headline, we believe this mechanism is about learning firsthand experience of what it means to be a generator of knowledge, what that looks like, and how to be able to experience that so that you can help others experience that. This kind of, if you want to put it within the debate around what is the best way to teach teachers how to teach, this puts a little bit of a stake in the area of general skills. That it's not just about teaching like a very structured pedagogy, but really learning making a conceptual shift in a general capacity. But it's even more general than just general skills. It's really about the process of learning. And then, there is a section in which they reflect on the processes they use to learn. It happens really organically. I mean, in the pilot, I was there during the trainings, and it's really interesting. Like, you don't even have to get to the teaching, because the teachers, they have learned in such a very different way, right? They've learned in the deposit into your mind way, and when they start to do experiments in the soil, and that way try to learn about, for example, the soil quality or the plant instead of writing it on the blackboard, they suddenly feel like, how am I teaching this to my students? I feel like I'm so much more interested in this subject. I'm learning so much better. why don't I use this to teach my students? So it happens quite organically, and then it's also structured within the curriculum to then reflect more broadly on what this means for how you want to teach the other subjects that you're involved in. So I'm going to show you sort of a range of results along with the primary leaving exam that I just showed you. And these results have all been pre-specified in a analysis plan and a pre-analysis plan. But we wanted to go beyond. What's kind of interesting is, like, given that this is this new method of learning and teaching, for it to have had effects on the standard exam is kind of interesting. But we also wanted to see if it has effects on the kind of higher order competencies, which are competencies that ministries of education around the world are trying to develop in students. But it's very difficult to figure out how to do that. So we measure scientific competencies through some innovative measures that, again, I'm going to call out my amazing co-author Vesall, who helped to develop some of these new measures of developing scientific competencies, higher order learning, and creative use of resources. We do test their pedagogy to really understand what they're doing. And we find that the students are more engaged, that they ask more questions, the students ask more questions, and the teachers spend time on concepts that are relevant to home life, which is I'm not going to be able to share until a couple of years probably the downstream effects of this on the homes and the communities. But because of this kind of local knowledge relevance, there may be additional effects that we haven't been able to measure yet. We also find that teachers kind of, because they see themselves as these generators of knowledge, they start seeing themselves as researchers. So if they have a problem, they learn about it. So if they want to learn about how to teach for something else, they learn about from their colleagues. So they're sharing a lot more information with their colleagues, and they have a lot more information about their students. So it looks like they're asking a lot of questions about their students. So as I mentioned, this is sort of, one literature to really see this in is the literature on how to improve teacher teaching. And we have some good evidence that structured pedagogy and teaching at the right level provides good impacts. Those, teach teachers with scripts and target very specific outcomes. This type of way, which some have called general skills learning, gives teachers more agency and more flexibility. And that allows them to then adjust to things like local knowledge or to other things that they think might be more useful. And we think that might have that might be more useful kind of as we think about 21st century skills. There is a literature on learning to learn interventions that is increasingly emphasized. And here we're able to provide some rigorous evidence in line with that. And then I guess, related to the kinds of skills that you need as technology kind of rapidly advances, as labor needs to be more flexible, this sort of sits within that literature of the type of human capital. It's not just about human capital accumulation. It might actually matter the type of human capital that you accumulate for the processes of economic growth and development to reach their potential. Okay, so where did this come from? This is actually originally, this was developed by an NGO that is about the application and generation of science called the FUNDAC in Colombia. This NGO was started by 3 physics professors who were very disillusioned with academia and felt that science had become just the purview of the elite and was only being kind of spread among certain numbers of people, and they really wanted science to be able to be more democratized. And so they quit their jobs and created this NGO that creates basically a rural university that integrates rural communities into scientific communities that create their own experiments. They did this in the mid-70s, and they were constantly in this process of action research. So they didn't do RCTs, but they were in this very structured experiment, find out about it, experiment, find out about it in that sense. And I actually was so inspired by this as a sophomore in college. I went there. It's in an hour outside of Cali. So I went in 1993, and it really radically shifted how I thought about development. I mean, it turned everything upside down about what I had believed about development. And so the idea essentially of the people who founded this was that development is truly about helping people become generators of knowledge. And so they then obviously developed this over time, and they worked on this, and then they worked with a bunch of NGOs around the world to help bring this to other places, and in particular, Kimanya Nenge Foundation in Uganda adapted this curriculum, and then so this project arose because Vesall had been in Uganda working with this NGO, came to me, he was visiting LSE, and he said, this is happening with, this, and I know you're kind of interested in this because of what you experienced in Fundayak, and I just thought this is fantastic. And Abhijit and I have been talking about using the scientific method to teach people, and so with farmers, and so we thought, okay, this is a perfect experiment to run. But honestly, we didn't know if you're going to teach the scientific method. This had been used for farmers. If you're going to teach primary school teachers this method, is this really going to have a learning effect for primary school students? That was definitely unclear. And so we tried to structure this RCT with the pre-analysis plan and with everything we designed so that we could really understand, does this really work for primary school students as a way of learning? And just to kind of say the process of rollout, which I'll talk a little bit more about the experimental design and stuff. Basically, the terms there's 3 terms in Uganda, and the teachers come voluntarily. Actually, they're only paid for their transport. They come in between terms for an intensive training of like around 11 days, and then during term there's a visit, usually once a month, from the tutors who train them to just observe and do some troubleshooting in each of the terms. So this is so there's a year of training basically that's done between terms, and then they go and apply it again with this action research type of format.
So Nava, before you move ahead,
sure.
let me ask a couple of questions. So the first one is a question from the audience. So giving teachers more agency empowerment may be helpful, but it needs a context for accountability. So this is from Amy Chin. So it is a tension in US education too, just wanting to allow for teachers to teach, but just not to ensure students get at least some minimal level of quality. How did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And I think if we had just said, teachers just teach however you like, give them agency, I don't think it would have had an impact. I think really the agency in a sense comes as a result, not as an aim, because as an initial aim, because basically it comes from learning a way of learning that is about experimentation, and then a natural desire to use experimentation in the classroom, which then gives teachers a sense of empowerment because it makes you an agent in your own production of knowledge. But it's not, it doesn't kind of leave them free to do whatever. I mean, they're still going to be affected by how many of their students go to the primary leaving exam. I mean, everything, all the incentives that they all had before gives them the same thing. And it's not like we're telling them not to teach their curriculum. In fact, they teach the exact same curriculum. And, our results show that in fact, they, on most of the subjects, the students in the treated schools do much better, even in the kind of standard traditional learning. Which suggests that the teachers aren't sort of using their agency to go off piste and teach a whole bunch of other stuff that they find interesting, but rather that they're finding a way to incorporate the methods that they found useful in their own learning through this training to help the students learn the concepts that are already in the curriculum.
So a related question somewhat is from me. So your starting slide showed that that more than 60% of the grade 5 kids can't read or write as grade 2 as requirements. So literally read a paragraph or do subtraction, 2-digit subtraction. But, and then here they're supposed to use data and evidence and put up hypotheses. So how what is the basic knowledge that a student need to have in order to be able to learn in this way? Is there a basic knowledge level that you need, or that's a question that kind of comes with me all the time. At what level do you need to be able to use this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I think one way to think about it is, imagine like in biology, for example, they're teaching them about plants, and they want to teach them how a leaf forms. And so the standard way of doing that is to draw the leaf on the blackboard and then write the names of the parts of the leaf there, right? Instead, what they end up doing when they have gone through this training is they take the kids out into the garden and they show them a leaf, and then they point out the parts of it that change, for example. And so that actually in some way is much easier to absorb if you don't, even if you don't have the reading, and what it does is make you then motivated to want to learn those things in a way that you may not if you can't read the blackboard, for example. Now, in our case, most of the kids, like I said, are in you know, level 6 and level 7, but a lot of, you know, some of them still can't read, right? And so, but I think this experimentation way is very different. Let me give you another example, again in biology, which was planting a potato. Okay. So they go out, they plant the potato all together, and then they watch it grow. And then while they're watching it grow, they like talk about the processes, they learn the words associated with it, etc. That has the effect, again, of a student who may have in the past just given up because they couldn't even read the blackboard, right? To wanting to then be involved in that process of discovery. It also has this other effect, which we're not going to be able to talk about today, but hopefully in the future, which is, you know, like this is anecdotal that I, you know, some of the parents told me. When the kid goes home, he now knows how to plant a potato. And so the parents and the grandparents who thought that education is totally worthless because these guys just learn like random, you know, scientific names of things, suddenly think this is like actually useful knowledge. And so I think that sort of combination of extra excitement and discovery and motivation with real tangible hands-on learning could make it even better for people who are less skilled to begin with.
Thank you.
Okay, actually, so on this, I give you a couple examples. Let me give you like the first example that has happened. So the teachers come into this training probably thinking they're going to do a regular training, you know, where somebody stands up on the board and says, here's how you teach, and you know, and instead they're asked to make shapes out of clay. And they have to make these shapes, and then they have to describe the objects. And so, you know, let me give you just an example. The teacher says, this is a cube. Okay, so the teacher makes that cube and says, this is a cube. And the tutor, and by the way, they're called tutors because they have this really interesting role. They're not, and they're very much like understood to be this way. They are not teachers. They're not trainers. They're not even discussion coordinators. They are tutors who are along the journey of discovery with the teachers. And some of these tutors don't even have secondary school education. So they were, you know, they're trained to just be coming alongside these guys as they go through this process and as they go through the curriculum, which is really question and answer based. Okay, so the tutor says, really, I see some dents in that shape. How would you explain it more precisely? And then works with the teacher to get more and more precise with the language. So the teacher suddenly realizes, God, I'm being really coarse with how I think about things. You know, I just thought this was a cube and that's enough. And, you know, that's a good enough standard. But actually it's true. Like, you know, it's not quite a cube. It has a little bit of different thing. And actually, how do I even know what the shape is? How do I even know the word for the shape? Where does that idea come from? It comes from a prior belief, a prior category, essentially, that I have in my head of what shapes are and what is a cube and what is another thing. And so if I want to be able to describe something to someone else, I am going to be based on my own, basically, priors and biases first. And I'm going to have to be really, really be able to be precise to be able to explain this. And then if I add like that's a simple shape. Now I want to, like, for example, describe a roof on the house on the top of somebody's house. That's a combination of shapes. And so that requires more and more precision because the complexity increases. What that does, it kind of really shakes the teachers at the beginning to kind of start with something like that, because first, it's so experiential. Second, it kind of introduces a level of humility to recognize that, you know, something that they thought was super simple and they're just like really good at. And, you know, teachers, there's a hierarchy and in especially in Africa, you know, of teachers and how much they know. And so suddenly teachers are like, well, actually, yeah, I didn't describe that very precisely. And it makes them open to a kind of learning that they may not otherwise be open to. And so then they continue along that path and they develop sort of additional scientific capacities. And you know, we describe these really fully in an appendix, but let me give you just some more examples, just so you kind of have a sense of this. So that was, you know, using precise language that goes throughout. Observing and describing the world with increasing clarity, again with real, really good examples where they go out and they do stuff, and then they realize that they're not describing things with the right amount of clarity. Designing experiments, so they're taught how to design really simple experiments and test hypotheses. Distinguishing between objective and subjective statements. So this is really important. Actually, I think it's really important for me too. When I was reading this, I was like, I should really do this much more. So we might say, oh, you know, the student has improved. But then you actually want to say, well, exactly, instead of saying the student has improved, you would say, you know, the student's test scores went up by this much. And so you don't make a subjective statement, you make an objective statement, and really understanding the difference between that. And then this last capacity is, to me, the most fascinating and potentially the most abstract, but it's actually one that they really grabbed onto, which is identifying processes worth studying and sources of data around you. So for example, they identify that the school garden is something that allows a very interesting process of data collection and data gathering, and a source of data that could help to explain various things in biology and other of the subjects. But even things like, for example, there's a segment I believe it's in the social studies curriculum, where they are asked to try to understand the beliefs of people around them and the way in which certain cultural norms arose in their community. So they go and ask elders in the community, what do you believe about, for example, a child who has this illness? And they gather the data and they try to understand how those beliefs formed. All of this is with the idea that knowledge is not a static concept. It's not a concept that, like, now I know the thing and now I give you the thing. It's rather something that you are in a constant process of discovering, and it actually has a dynamic nature to it. And so we need to be in relationship basically to the knowledge. And this, I mean, even that example was one in which, you know, the elders were first of all very happy about being asked about those things, but it also just made people question, okay, where do these social norms come from? And, you know, are they based, what kind of evidence are they based on, without actually saying that, you know, just as a natural outgrowth of doing an exercise like this. And then, you know, just one last thing on this, and then making the link to teaching. So one thing that this is very interesting that it does, and I think why it makes the link to teaching much easier, is that when some of the concepts are brought up, for example, like properties of objects, so they are linked to broader concepts. So let me give you an example. So there's a section about how water changes shape and phase. Essentially, you know, you have water, the nature of water, and then, you know, sometimes, and you probably remember in your primary school how you would like create steam and create ice, and all of that is water, but it has different properties. And it has different properties when it's steam and when it's ice, and it can change phase. And so as they are learning that, they're asked just a simple question. Do you think humans also change phase? Does this also apply to humans? How would you describe the qualities of a human? And is there anything that has to do with, you know, that basically says we are describing properties? Does that also apply to humans? And when we get to the teaching part, the teachers start to really think about the fact that they literally come up with it. You know, just like water was able to change shape, and I wouldn't have recognized it in its other shape, you know, maybe my students can also learn and grow and become different types. And so it creates this growth mindset rather than, again, this static object. And I think that connection also makes them more motivated to learn the science. This also says, as we talked about the objective and subjective, that this also applies to students, and this is in the teaching to teach, in the learning to teach section. We say, remember how you talked about objective and subjective statements about the world. When have you said a subjective statement about the student? Do you think that was, what kind of objective evidence would you want to gather to know whether that subjective statement was true or not? So it's kind of a test of that. And then, critical thinking, creativity and stuff. I'll talk about that in a second. And so then, you reflect on the process. And as I said, it sort of happens organically. And then there's a structured part of it where they analyze how it was that the way they learned affected what they learned. So even with the cube, how did the way we taught you that affect how you learned and thought? And it changed, your capacity to use words to their greatest power, and gave you a deeper understanding of the conceptually of shape as itself. And it then it asks them to reflect on what are the conditions of a teacher that make the learning most effective. And again, they come up with these answers of like not assuming an answer, but asking questions, having an orientation of humility, being open to data and refinement of ideas. This comes out of doing all the experimentation that they have done thus far. That just seems a kind of natural way of learning. And so then they they develop and analyze the pedagogy around scientific thinking, exploratory learning, problem posing, etc. But crucially, there's no point in which we give them the curriculum that they're supposed to teach in their classroom and then say, here's a way to teach this, or how would you even how would you apply this? But we ask them, how would you apply this to how you teach in general? And then give them the ability to do that. Okay, so here are the predictions that come out of that. And again, this was pre-specified in the analysis plan, the pre-analysis plan. So the idea basically is that, there's a baseline pedagogy, this idea of depositing, and Paulo Freire, some wonderful work on this, that essentially like the key for the teacher is to be really good at putting this objective knowledge into the heads of the students. And the best way to be a student is to be as passive and empty as possible so that the knowledge can absorb into you. And so that both the student and the teacher have a particular orientation. Then the idea here is that the teacher will change the pedagogy. So this is kind of our theory of change here. The teacher changes the pedagogy, and within the classroom, then the students would become more engaged, they'd ask more questions, they spend more time on concepts relevant to home life. And we also predict that the teachers would become more sympathetic and more empathetic, because they're more able to take on the perspective of their students, to learn about their students and to learn from their colleagues. And these are the measures that we measure in the survey. And then the student learning would improve along multiple dimensions, including the traditional learning of standardized tests, but scientific competencies critical, as we talked about. And then, this we're not going to be able to show you yet, but in a couple of years, we hope to show you. And if I get time at the end, I'll share with you how we're thinking about measuring this. But, as in the example of how to plant a potato that I mentioned, we think this might affect how parents and grandparents and others in the community view the value of education. So we think it could affect the demand for education from the parents. We think it could also have significant spillovers to other siblings and within the household in terms of the practical knowledge that is generated within the home. That's something we're going to sort of hopefully do in the future. Let me tell you about this experiment in particular and exactly how we ran it. So we used the Bruin-McKenzie 2009 paper to do matched pairs of schools, so 14 control schools, 14 plus 1 treated schools. And in year one, Kamanya trained 40 teachers from these treated schools. And in year two, they trained 40 more teachers from these schools. So, on average, the schools have about, you'll see this in a second, about maybe 6 to 7 upper primary. They were asked to focus on upper primary school teachers. upper primary teachers, and so they're getting more and more saturated basically after year 2. And so this was year 1 training. We did the baseline. This was year 1 training. This is year 2 training, and the data we're going to show you today is from 2019 with analysis data. We do have we then did a new baseline, and we were able to add 57 schools once we got more funding, and went to another sub-county, because this is sort of within the sub-county. This was all the primary schools that were there. And then this is our hope is to be able to give you some results augmented in the future.
So Nava, before you
Yes.
move on the intervention a little bit. So Felicia Masaki has a question on, is this a specially packaged program or curriculum that is used to help teachers learn? So meaning standardized, this is a periodic one-off program, or is it some kind of lifestyle structured thing happening along the time? So what she's concerned about is if over time teachers go back to what they were initially doing, if it's just a one-off thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways to answer that question, right? So one thing is just to think about the timeline. So I think it was really crucial that they basically come for 11 days, then they go back and teach for that whole term, and then once a month the tutor comes in and is like doing troubleshooting with them. Then they come back to the classroom together, and they learn again, and then they come back, etc. So that kind of constant reinforcement. There's also a lot of evidence that, especially in year 2, the teachers are starting to learn from each other. So if you think about this kind of, and this is something we'll be able to study even more in future years, but there's a kind of reinforcement. So rather than the worry, which I could completely understand, which I think is the case often in some trainings where, there's a depreciation of a new skill, because this is such, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, it's like, there's a new way of thinking of things. It's hard to implement. It might be really easy to have it depreciate. And I think both because of the way it was implemented, and then because of because of this sort of reinforcement across the community of teachers who's growing, it doesn't look like that's happening. But it's certainly the case that we could have just, when we look at year 1 teachers, for example, in year 2, are they doing worse? It doesn't appear to be the case. Although I can't say a lot about that now, because we can just look, because the treatment is at the school level. We don't have the sample size to really be able to distinguish between various teachers, but that is something we'll be able to address more in the future.
Okay, and the second question is from Katsushi Emai. So would it be possible to break down the mean effect in 2 parts? The first one being the direct effect coming from the intervention, making teachers producers of knowledge, and that resulted in the method of teaching. And the second part being the indirect effect due to change in incentives or psychological changes, given that they're doing exactly the same teaching methods as before.
Yeah, so I guess I just want to understand that question a bit more. I mean, if I don't know if that's a question mainly about kind of motivation, that basically the intrinsic motivation of teachers might increase because they are excited about what they're teaching, if I understand correctly. And I don't think that that's the case, but let's leave that for the end. And I think we can discuss that more. There's various reasons why we don't think the motivation, the mechanism is a kind of motivational mechanism, both because of we do see pedagogical shifts, in terms of the way that the teachers are teaching the material just on their own. The students are much more engaged. They're asking much more. The teachers are asking many more questions. The students are asking more questions. And as I go through, I'm going to sort of talk through why we wouldn't see this mechanism to be as strong, as a real. Essentially, we should think the mechanism as a capacity shift in the way they teach.
Okay.
Great. And I'm sure my co-authors could probably answer as well on this when we open up to questions too. Also on the previous question, I was thinking Vesall might have some thoughts as well. Okay, so this was done very closely with the Ministry of Education in Uganda. The district education official asked treated schools to send 2 to 4 teachers. And 75% of teachers actually wanted to come and participated in majority of teaching. And so that's about 40% of teachers in the treated schools that are participating in the training. And so we do an intent to treat. So when you think about the treated schools, not every teacher is being trained there. So we've only got 40% of teachers trained in those schools at year 2. But as I mentioned, we do this pairwise matching. And so we have a pair fixed effect. So all the analysis you'll see has a pair fixed effect and a numerator fixed effect when relevant. Some of it is admin data, so it's not relevant to include a numerator fixed effects. We cluster the standard errors at the school level because that's where we randomized. So obviously the assumption is random assignment. And for the inference, we use randomization inference. We give you the standard p-values, but we also give you an exact p-value from randomization inference, and we correct for multiple hypothesis testing. So I'm going to show you all of those p-values when we go. And just to show you the balance on school characteristics, so schools can be government or private; those are balanced. The number of teachers, that's balanced. The percent of P6 and P7 teachers. So those are really the ones that we're targeting. So you can see sort of that why 4 teachers is about 40% of the treated schools. Percent of teachers that have a diploma, that's relatively low. Or any in-service training, enrollment, and the pupil-teacher ratio. And so the data and sort of everything is balanced, and as a joint balance test is also balanced across the control and treatment schools. I'm going to show you results from a number of different data instruments. I'm not going to explain them all here. I'll explain them as I explain the results, just to make it more interesting. But they come from a survey we did of the teachers, from extensive classroom observation, from the primary leaving results, student survey, student assessment, and science fairs and competitions that were done in the district. Okay. So I already talked about the primary leaving exam. This is, as any of you who worked in this context know, it's incredibly high stakes. And it's 4 subjects: English, science, math, and social studies. You register for the exam in May and take the exam in October. And so the anonymized results were ready in January, and we purchased them in February, and we merged with the registration numbers. So it includes students who registered but didn't sit for the exam. They are basically counted as failing. And so we analyzed the subject score and the pass rate. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you the standardized result. But on the right-hand side, I'm also going to just show you the raw data in some way, just for you for full transparency, for you to see where the distributional shifts are coming from, for example. So just to, go to this first before looking at the standardized thing, you can just see English. So the treated are in blue and the control is in red. It's in Uganda, it's 1 to 9. 9 is best and 1 is worst. You can just see the distribution shifting all the way to the right. And that's sort of what you see across the board. That translates, we standardize using the control mean here, and that makes a 0.64 standard deviation shift. And whether you use the p-value or the randomization inference, you get the similar results. We also correct for multiple hypothesis testing, and that's not as robust, but that may have to do with the different results. So that's sort of math and social studies. Let me just see where. Somehow I'm missing the ones on. Oh yeah, here we go. That's English. Sorry, that's English and science. Here we go. And here's math and social studies and the pass rate. So the pass rate is what I'd already talked about. You're increasing the pass rate by 24 percentage points from a mean of 50%. And then social studies also really big shift. In math, there is not a big shift. There is no significant effect on math. That may have to do with, actually, when we showed these results to the NGO, they said, actually, there are math books in the curriculum, but we never shared them with the teachers because we were focused on the other subjects. But maybe these results suggest that we should actually share them. And this is kind of interesting because in one way it says, right, if it was just about general skills of pedagogical tools that would apply for everything, then they should have also learned how to teach math. Or if it was, back to that last question, Martina, if it was just motivation, like I'm so much more motivated to teach now, I should have been able to also teach math well, right? We think instead it's really about, Vesall gives this great analogy of like a recipe that like a food, you eat the food and you can't really make the recipe unless you've eaten the food first, or you could, but then you'd be like a cook like me, not such great food. And so you really want to be able to taste it and know exactly what it should taste like before you can kind of implement a recipe. And so that's why we think, so it's going to be interesting to see if they start to implement the math and have the teachers learn how to learn math in this way, if that would change these results.
So before you move on, there was a question from Anna Tomstedt that I'm going to ask, which is similar to previous questions that have been asked in the Q&A as well on the language. Mm-hmm. So and now what Anna is saying here is it surprising that the effects on English and science are very similar? And is this any evidence that the training affected the teacher language? And there were previous questions as well that's been answered, but I realized maybe we should bring it up on the fact what the language spoken in school is and what the language spoken at the training is. And is that English or is this local languages?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe Vesall, do you want to answer that? I think you would know more.
Sure. Yeah, the medium of instruction for upper primary in Uganda is English. Teachers are encouraged to use mother tongue in lower primary, but the focus of our study is upper primary. The training itself is in English, but of course, the tutors encourage the teachers to really consider which language is best equipped to increase a student's understanding. So what I've observed sometimes in schools is that when there's often this norm of only teaching in English because the parents, in fact, send their kids to school to learn English specifically, but this often prevents a student from understanding a concept. And so during the teacher training, there's a lot of discussion about what is the best approach to help a student learn a concept. So there is some nuance in the approach teachers take qualitatively. The other question on is there evidence that training affects the teacher language skills? Responses that we've given to other questions is that, as Nava mentioned, our true end line is planned for either the end of 2022 or early 2023, depending on how COVID affects academic calendars. But we do hope to be able to implement a teacher assessment at that time. And so, yeah, thank you for those comments and questions. Hopefully, they'll enrich our instrument at that point.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about science shows. This is a science fair competition that Vesall worked with the Ministry of Education to design. So first I'm going to show you the standard way that science is assessed. Scientific capacities are assessed in, for example, P6 Term 2 science exam. So, how are reptiles, look at number 6, how are reptiles similar to amphibians in terms of reproduction? Correct answer, this is the coding for the teacher. Correct answer is both reptiles and amphibians lay eggs. Wrong answer is both are warm-blooded. So these are you can see all these questions are very rote memorization types of questions. In contrast, the Ministry of Education says that what they would like the students to learn from P6 science is far more than rote memorization. They want them to apply correct scientific processes in investigation of various phenomena by identifying problems, designing investigation processes, inference, etc. So these are the capacities that are supposed to be developed, but they are not the ones that are tested. And so what we do is work with them to have these science fairs, so each stream of primary 6 class will organize 3 or 4 groups of students who will prepare a science-oriented activity on 1 or 2 subject competencies, which is either experiments that compare at least 2 different approaches to conserving resources in the community, either soil, minerals, fuel, water, and air, or at least 2 approaches for preparing clean and safe water for drinking and washing. So again, really localized knowledge, but design the experiment to compare these ways. 1 or 2 groups each doing a resource or water activity. And then the judges had a rubric for evaluating these competencies. around framing the problem, designing the experiment, articulating and testing a hypothesis, measuring outcomes, and articulating independently. So, as an example of how they measure it, students had a clearly articulated hypothesis. How do you measure it? You give them 1 if you had no idea what hypothesis the students were testing, 5 if the student mentioned a hypothesis but it was not clear, 10 if the student mentioned a very clear hypothesis. Okay. So really a kind of trying to be objective across the measurement, and they measured, obviously it was double blind, they didn't know the treatment or control groups. What you see is that there's a really big effect across all the, across the index of the rubric of treatment schools in their performance in the science show. And so you can again see on the right the distribution of really moving. And across those different domains, this is how it is broken down. This isn't in the analysis plan, but just the index is in the pre-analysis plan. But just to give you a more insight into where the results are coming from, there's no effect on framing the hypothesis. We think it's probably because we actually framed it for them in the letter of invitation. There is an effect on kind of designing the experiment and how clear the hypothesis was, but particularly on these like higher order things of observing and communicating both the data and communicating the results. Okay, you can see how many other results I have, so I'm just going to whip through them so that I know we only have about 8 minutes left. So bear with me and I'll go through the rest and then we'll have some time for questions if that's okay. So how do we measure higher order learning? If what we want is not just the rote learning of, what makes an amphibian different from a reptile, but really this higher order learning, what do we do? So there's just standard recall, obviously. Then there's applied understanding, which is, one way to think about that as just reading comprehension. So how many patients were, you can read that at the beginning, at which school was the fire outbreak, how many patients were admitted on Sunday, you can just read this. And then critical thinking and reasoning, there isn't a lot, so these are, by the way, in our assessment tool. Critical thinking, there aren't a lot of good examples of how to assess that. But here's one that was created. So one is, on a quantitative level, how many more patients were admitted on Wednesday than Thursday? But sort of on a more qualitative level, how do you get at this kind of differentiation and really being able to organize and categorize beliefs and ideas? And so, Sarah believes the purpose of education is to help people get jobs. And, think about these statements. Which of these statements support Sarah's thoughts? So what is evidence that is in support of a prior belief? And that is what we think of as higher order learning and what we ask an assessment of for the students. Okay. And then for creativity, we use this task that has been used in there's the Journal of Labor Economics paper using this task. It's been used pretty standard. Students are given an object and they're asked to name as many unique and unusual uses as they can in 1 minute. And we use objects that are, again, found in their environment. So plastic bottles, maize plant remains, and bamboo stems. And you get a higher score if it's a more unusual use. And it has to be like a legitimate use. So so you can think about like furniture or roofing, but rare use would be like a float or a life jacket or for bamboo. Okay. So what we find is on higher order learning, so we've got reading comprehension, you've got a 73% standard deviation, change, critical thinking, and then the index of creativity, really strong increases across the board. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see the raw data and the shifts in distribution. Okay, so we use the Stallings observation tool to come into the classroom at random times and to audit the teachers. And the observers take snapshots at each segment. They observe how many students are engaged in the activity with the teacher. So even if one student is actually reading something, how many other students are paying attention? We analyze the P7 classes separately because they are often having to do like revision work on their own. So I'll show you how those results look. So again, so as you move across, this is basically, you should think of this as a 39% increase in more students paying attention in class. And then for P7, it's kind of interesting because like a lot of P7 work, you're not teaching any new material in P7. You're just helping them revise for the exam. And so one of the things we ask is percent of time spent on activity in P7 when teacher is not around. And what you can see is that the control group, half the time they're actually learning and half the other time they're kind of goofing off and doing other stuff. And that, increases to about, 75% of the time they're learning in the treatment group. They're observed to be learning, and the other half, 25%, they're still goofing off. Okay, so for asking questions, in order to not have the kind of standard demand bias that, it might be that we're in the classroom and then we're observing them like that. Instead, we ask students to recall whether in term 2 or 3, they asked the teacher to help them with a problem that they didn't understand and which teacher that was. And then we aggregate the student responses. So for example, the percent of students who identified P6 teacher in X in school Y. We also looked at corporal punishment, again, from the qualitative work, where it seemed that at least some of the teachers through the pilot training had some impact on this. In term 2 or 3, did a teacher beat them or cane them? And we construct the same measure of adding this. We find a significant effect on 6% change on student inquisitiveness. We don't find any effect on corporal punishment. And we think it might be because of the way that we asked the question. The question was asked about any teacher over the last term 2 or 3, and a bunch of teachers hadn't gone through it in term 2, but had gone through it in term 3. So we may that may change as we, look farther down the line. It's also a very hard thing to change. I mean, I remember one of the teachers told me it's so easy for them to admit that they beat students, because there's this expression in Uganda that they told me that the best way to get knowledge to go from one ear into the other through the head is to hit it in. And so that's how strong the belief is. And, that might be a harder one to change, or it might be more a matter of time. So, and then finally, how does this teacher change how they look at the world and their students? Do they learn more about their students' lives, in particular, to change the subjective statements into more objective statements? So we asked 6 students, did you attend school yesterday? Do you attend school 2 days ago? What's the relationship you have with the guardian you stay with? And then we asked the teacher to about these 6 students on all 3 of these things, and we measure the percent of correct responses. And that's why we know how much they're kind of finding out about their students. And then we want to know, are they learning more from their colleagues? Have you spoken to your colleague about how to better manage the classroom, visited any of the other classrooms to help inform teaching practice? So these are the spillovers that we're talking about, where the pedagogical shifts are actually happening. Planned classroom activities together. It only equals 1 if both sides about each other say yes. And so we sum across the 3 questions for an intensity measure. And again, in both things, we find a really big shift. All right, I have 1 minute left. So I'm gonna just say there's additional results in the paper that were not in the pre-analysis plan, but really suggest that there is a kind of additional effect of learning and community engagement in local knowledge that seems to be arising from these teachers. I won't show this. One final thing, that when we compare this to other interventions that that impact learning adjusted, this is a measure of schooling that actually is adjusting for quality and actual student learning. This paper really appears to be quite impactful in a cost effectiveness analysis. So just final words that, we find that this learning to learn approach has large treatment effects along many dimensions, including more traditional ones, but also the higher order capacities and capabilities for creativity and scientific higher order learning. It appears to be largely due to this new approach to pedagogy, both because of the shifts we see in pedagogy and the way in which the results show across the board, in the ones in which the teachers had learned to learn. That's different from a structured pedagogy. So it's basically associating diverse pedagogies to the learning objective, instead of giving one pedagogy that kind of be for all. And importantly, especially in this context where there is such an emphasis on higher hierarchy and on expertise coming from knowing the answers. This is really about being willing to explore the discovery of knowledge together with your students and to not know the answer. And so finally, we kind of want to really look at the effects on the teachers. We want to, once we have a little bit more of a sample size, we'll be able to look much more at heterogeneous treatment effects. Because there are naturally variation in the number of students in the home that have been exposed to this process, we will be able to have a difference in density of exposure within the home and to look at the intra-household spillovers as a function of that between siblings and then to parents and communities in the demand for education. And finally, it's just a little bit pie in the sky, but hopefully, given how much this experimental method actually requires you to look around and see how you could use local objects and develop local knowledge, that may also, both through the capabilities it develops and the kind of engagement with local priorities and local knowledge, may potentially increase the returns to education and the kind of jobs that these students ultimately get. So thanks very much. I'll leave it there and open the floor.
Thank you, Nava, for a very interesting and exciting presentation. So I'm going to open up the floor for live questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and I will unmute you for questions. So the first question comes from Rajesh Ramachandran, and you are now unmuted, Rajesh.
Thanks so much for super interesting talk. One thing I was just curious about was that given this whole range of assessments you carried out and the way you started off your motivation, I was wondering if you had any assessment tools that could be benchmarked to international comparisons, because I was very curious to know now, where do these students stand in terms of, say, standard skills that we measure for students in grade 6 and 7? Where would they fall in the world distribution in some sense? Thanks.
So, the primary leaving exam is the one that nationally all the students actually undertake. And so that's the kind of best benchmark. But my co-authors are assessment experts. So let me open up for both of them to say anything about the other survey instruments and how that might benchmark.
Abhijit is on mute.
Abhijit's on mute.
No, go ahead, Vesall.
Okay. Yeah, I guess what I would say is just echoing what Nava shared. The learning adjusted years of schooling that Nava had to rush through because of the time constraints at the end, which shows the cost effect. Developing country settings, there's almost no sort of assessment question, especially at the primary level, that measures higher order thinking, critical thinking. And these kinds of questions need some kind of contextual awareness to develop. And so, yeah, if you have thoughts on how to benchmark that against some of the other approaches, please feel free to share them.
That's great. Thank you. So next question is going to come from Amy Chin. So I'm now unmuting you, Amy.
Hi, Nava. I was wondering what's going on in the teaching schools that are producing teachers. Have they changed the way they teach teachers how to teach? Like, are there younger cohorts being taught methods that are more similar to what you're doing, and can what you're doing be put in the teaching schools in the future?
Yeah, Vesall, I'm going to let you answer that. You're going to answer it better than me, but yeah, go ahead. You've been working closely with the Ministry of Education.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in fact, I had some conversations with some principals of primary teacher colleges the last couple of weeks. There is a shift at the secondary level towards a more competency-based education curriculum. And there hasn't been a parallel shift in teacher training at the teacher training colleges. I think part of the point that we're making in this paper is that these approaches to teacher training often kind of pay lip service to something like student-centered learning. And they tell the teacher what student-centered learning is, or the philosophy of student-centered learning. But to really appreciate what it is, you have to experience it first. And that's something that we're talking about now with the primary teacher colleges in a couple districts in Uganda is how, and also with our partner organization, how do you formulate a training for the trainers, essentially, so that the trainers of these colleges can create the same type of experiential learning environment coupled with this metacognitive analysis of the pedagogical environment, such that both the experience of learning can be introduced to new teachers, but also the analysis of the pedagogy can be associated with that experience instead of just blindly shared with them without any experience of learning in that way. So that's a great question, and it's a focus of ours moving forward.
Next question comes from James Allen. You're unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, James.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much. Really exciting talk, very interesting results. I was wondering if, kind of prior to the study or moving forward, if you have any thoughts about how this treatment might differ by subject area. You know, just from the description of the whole learning to learn approach, it sounds like it's very well suited for teaching science. And in fact, I think all or at least most of the examples given were science-based. But then something like math is something where I would just expect it to be a little bit less of, you know, applying the scientific method, a little bit more of having to learn formulas. And sure enough, that's you don't find strong results on the math subject. But then it also sounds like there was maybe an input difference with them not going over that book. So I guess moving forward, is there, it would be really interesting to make sure that the math curriculum is taught and see if that is differ, or do you, I don't know, just any thoughts about kind of how they might differ by subject area?
Yeah, that's great. Vesall and I were just talking about the math curriculum yesterday to just see like, how exactly do you teach this math with this method? But one thing I want to say about social studies, so I didn't give as many examples on the social studies, but the example, for example, about like the norms and the beliefs in your community, that comes from social studies. So it is really a recognition of how how path dependent certain beliefs can be and certain norms can be, and how history can affect your actions going forward. I mean, there's a lot within social studies that I think this kind of critical thinking and scientific method can help to develop in terms of capacities. But Vesall, maybe you want to talk about the math, because I know we were exactly talking about that.
Yeah, sorry. There's a couple things. So one is, yeah, I think the input question is one. There is some nuance in the result. So for example, math is something that I suspect there's a difference in the sense that it's a cumulative body of knowledge. So students really need to have foundations from previous years in order to learn the content in the current year. With that said, you know, when we give an assessment to the P6 students, and we didn't pre-specify subject result outcomes, but when you do dissect the results based on subject, we have really large effect on the math scores in the P6 students. So this might suggest, you know, there's many things that this could suggest, but one thing it could suggest is that the foundation is needed earlier, and we might see large math effects moving forward. But another thing is I don't buy necessarily that this approach can't be applied to math. In fact, knowing some of the curriculum that is tailored around math, you know, there's ways of teaching students to experientially extract the number pi, right? Just looking at a circle, measuring, you know, cutting it up into different pieces, forming a rectangle, and looking at the ratio of the width and the length, and discovering the number pi, right? And so this is, you know, it's an exciting way to learn, and then also it's a way that helps people recognize that the language of math exists in all of the world around us, and maybe there are more numbers worth discovering and exploring. I also know, I don't know if Abhijit wants to share something about this, but he has some work precisely on you know, math and the use of math in a context of one's life that is relevant to one's life, as opposed to just kind of you know, classroom learning. And there's really positive effects in that work as well. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe I was going to add that. I mean, we have this work in India where we compare children who are, well, the first thing we do is we just measure that children who are selling vegetables in the market can do certain types of math extremely fast and accurately. And then when we change the framing of the same math and exact same maths and make it into, write it in the language of formal math, they are immediately discouraged. They do much worse. So I think partly math is about comfort with being able to take ownership of the concepts, rather than, so when you tell them literally, we've done the following, which is ask them the same question either before or after, sometimes with objects and sometimes with numbers, with like in abstract. And when it's abstract, they reach for a pen and paper and they try to do something that looks like the implementation of an algorithm, but not a successful one. And then on the other side, when you ask them just like that, then they start to think about it as something that they do in their day-to-day life, and therefore they then can solve it. So I do think that a lot of it is about confidence. And I think if this process generates confidence in their own sense of learning, this could change math as much as anything else.
I think this is the last question, actually. It's from, we're reaching out of time, even if we wish we could continue this for the rest of the evening, right? This is Emmanuel Bisimungo. I'm unmuting you.
Okay, good. Sorry, I joined late, but my question is, thank you for the good presentation about research on education in Uganda. I'm actually Ugandan. So I want to know, did you look at both UPE schools and then private schools so that we can be able to see the differences in impacts, across the different schools? And also, did you have also a local collaborator to see if these results actually can be discussed and then get incorporated in policy frameworks within, within the education sector here in Uganda? Thank you.
I'm gonna let my Ugandan resident collaborator answer that question. Vesall, go ahead.
Thank you, Emmanuel. It would be nice to connect. I'm actually in Uganda right now, and I've presented this research to the Ministry of Education a few times, and they're aware of the research. So yes, it's in the government, the UPE schools as well as the private schools. And we shared earlier, we intend to look at heterogeneous treatment effects when we collect the full sample of results in, depending on when the 2021 academic or 2022 academic school year ends. Like, anyway, I'll one of those two. But for now, we don't have a large enough sample size to detect any difference in the effects. So I don't want to comment on it yet, but it doesn't seem like there's a significant difference qualitatively, at least. But yes, this approach to, I think all of us here are really interested in thinking about what steps do we have to take, do we need to take as a community to translate research into policy. And certainly something that I'm very interested in and thinking about how to do. And so creating these networks, sharing the research with broader populations. I have very close relationships with the district education office. And so hopefully the conversation will get rolling. But it's also a conversation that needs some time. So hopefully it'll happen sooner than later.
Thanks to everyone. So I see there are still questions. James Allen has a question. I suggest that you actually email Nava, Abhijit, and Vesall this question, because we're not going to have time to answer it. Thank you so much, Nava, for presenting this very interesting work. And thanks to Vesall joining from Uganda and Abhijit joining as well. Next seminar is on the 27th of April, and then if I'm making a guess, I think we're moving continent because it's Claudio Ferraz, and I bet it's going to be on Brazil. So until then, take care, stay healthy, and Nava, once again, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for coming and inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vesall and Abhijit too.